This is the fundamentals of communicating about climate change. And I just wanted to say welcome and thank you all for coming. It means a lot to me and I'm sure to all the panelists. And yeah, we're excited to present this to you. My name is Izzy Luca. You can just call me Izzy. And I will be hosting and moderating this event on behalf of Crew. And let's get into it. All right, so going over the event program, I just did a welcome. We're going to go over the event program now, and we're also going to do an introduction to Crew, and that's going to take about 5 minutes or so. We're going to have panelist introductions following that. Then we will get into what is an intersectionality event. We'll go over the discussion topics, some event goals that I just to let you know, like what I'm hoping you get out of it, just so you know. And we're going to have some fun, really low-key audience participation. It's just going to be through the chat function. So yeah, be ready for that, but it's going to be totally low-key. Then we'll have the panel discussion, the question and answer, and then at the very end, we'll go through resources, closing, and thank you. And I also just wanted to give a quick disclaimer. We may have some internet issues that just happen sometimes with webinars, so just in case anything comes up, we will be working on it as it goes, but yeah, keep that in mind. Yeah, so for an introduction to Crew, or Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, this is the organization I'm currently interning at. And yeah, if you've never heard of it before, Crew is actually an extension of the Better Future Project, along with 350 Mass and Divest Ed. So together we are all part of the Better Future Project. And our mission statement is as follows on the slide. So Crew is a network of local leaders building grassroots climate resilience through inclusive and hands-on education, service, and planning. Together, we are working to equip families and communities with the resources and capacity to prepare for and respond to local climate changes equitably, sustainably, and collaboratively. So basically, we just, from our mission statement, education, service, and planning, we try to focus our programs around that. So as you can see, education, we have intersectionality events is one thing we do, which is exactly what you're a part of right now, just informational about a certain topic. We have Climate Preparedness Week, which we have as the last week of September. It's like a series of events. This most recent one was all virtual, as this was COVID. We have interfaith summits. For service, we unfortunately haven't been able to do a ton of in-person stuff just because of COVID and everything. But we actually did have one of my colleagues, Ethan, deliver air conditioning units to a vulnerable community in Brockton, which was awesome. And for planning, we also have Crew teams. We are still getting that off the ground, but we also have climate resilience hubs, which I believe we have around 44 right now. So that's everything with Crew. And here is the Crew team. So we have Craig Altimos, and as the executive director, Reverend Vernon K. Walker as the program manager, and I kind of work under both of them, with both of them, to figure out what I'm doing, you know, how can I help? And actually, Reverend Vernon Walker is my mentor in the internship I'm doing right now. We also have Margaret Thurston and Ethan McDonough, and they are both helping with tech right now for this event, which I appreciate a lot. Yeah, so if you have, if you need me to repeat, or if you missed a question at all, you can just send them a message and they'll put it in the chat anyways, but if you have anything go on, you can just let them know. And for their respective titles are Coordinator for Climate Resilience Hubs and Special Project Coordinator. And in the bottom is me, Isabella Luca. I am a CFSI fellow, which is College for Social Innovations, yeah, which is where I'm doing my intern at. And then we also have my colleague, Gufran Bulbul, and he is the Research and Intersectionality Coordinator. All right, so we will be doing panelist introductions now. We're just going to go one by one, and I'm going to read you a little bit of their bio. So first up, we have Rishya Narayanan, and she is from Mass Audubon. So Rishya Narayanan, MS, is a multimedia science communicator specializing in environmental science and science communications and policy. At Mass Audubon, Rishya tells the story of the organization's climate action work, using values and solution-focused language to inspire broad audiences towards tackling our collective climate change. So next up, we have Simone C. from Spring Forward. Simone C. is a sophomore in high school. She is the member support coordinator in Sunrise Boston and the curriculum coordinator in Spring Forward, a high school-led climate education organization. And we also have Frida G, who also works at Spring Forward. So Frida G currently works as a curriculum ambassador at Spring Forward, an organization working with youth on youth climate organization. We also have Lindsay Jordan. Lindsay Jordan is the supervisor of visitor education at the New England Aquarium, where she's worked for the last 10 years. She has a degree in psychology and focuses especially on how to use psychology to better communicate complicated issues like climate change. So perfectly relevant for today. She is also the network coordinator for the National Network of Climate Change Interpretation, which is also referred to and probably will be here on referred to as NACI. Yes, and lastly, but not leastly, we have Julia Novak-Caldwell. She actually was my professor last semester. She's awesome. So Julia Novak-Caldwell is a lecturer at the University of New Hampshire in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment. Her teaching and research focuses on environmental conservation and sustainability through the lens of social equity and justice. Okay, so that's everybody that's going to be helping present this to you today. All right, so going forward, some of you may have some background in what intersectionality can mean, what intersectionality events are, but just to clear that up for all of you, I can just read through. So the definition of intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorization such as class, race, gender that create overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination and disadvantage. So it was actually coined, the term was coined by a law professor, Kimberly Crenshaw, through her writing, and which she looked at discrimination and oppression surrounding having multiple intersecting identities, so particularly people of color and women, hence the roots in civil rights movement and feminism. But the more contemporary usage of intersectionality can mean have it as like a bit of a blanket term for issues that intersect and are interconnected. So during this event, we want to be able to understand both uses of intersectionality and be able to see how they may apply in terms of communicating, educating, and taking action in climate change. And it's definitely important to keep in mind that climate change may be experienced differently for different people, and understanding these differences may actually help us become better climate change communicators, educators, and activists. And to give you a little bit of what CREW does specifically with what their purpose is of having intersectionality events at CREW, we use them to raise awareness and start discussions in local communities around these intersecting issues. All right, so now moving on to the discussion topics. I'm sure you've seen from the title, you have a little bit of an idea of what we'll be talking about today, but just to go through them, we'll be talking about communicating about climate change, education around climate change, and taking action. So how can we be most successful in talking about climate change? How do we start if we have no idea how to start and haven't necessarily really tried before? How do we turn that communication into education, and how do we know when there's a right moment to do that? And then how do we take what we've learned with education and communication and turn that into meaningful action that we can take and use in our lives every day? There is many reasons why these are all important to discuss. Just thinking about climate change in particular, climate change is already happening. It's affecting people disproportionately. It's not temporary, and it's long-term. All important reasons to talk about climate change in general. But another good thing to note is that climate change, especially in my own life, thinking about it is a very overwhelming topic for a lot of people, and it can be difficult to even think about thinking about it, if that makes sense. Definitely knowing where to start with that is important. And also that climate challenges just won't go away, and we have to adapt to them and prepare for them as communities. And that begins with communication, education, and action. All right, so here are event goals and takeaways. Yeah, so one thing that I knew I really wanted people to get out of this, I want you to leave feeling empowered, that you can bring further discussion into your life around climate change and carry that into further action in your own ways. And yeah, something that we will also be coming back to is this big takeaway of communication and education around climate change is action. I know it may not seem like it all the time for sure, but it is action in its own way. And I'm hoping that's something that we can take away. All right, so we are moving into our first audience participation opportunity. And again, you can just use your chat and just type your guess in here. This is for everyone, so don't be shy. The question is, what percentage of Americans do you think believe in global warming currently? And yeah, and I will pause here to check on the chat and to see. Oh, a lot of guesses. Yes, I see everything from 40% to 80%. Yeah, absolutely a ton of guesses. I hope more than 50%. I love that. Okay, well, I actually looked at a survey and that was done most recently in 2020. So here's the answer. All right, so as of 2020, 73% of Americans believe in global warming, which is more than I thought as well. It's definitely more than what I imagined, but it's really interesting and I guess almost a little hopeful there, and good to know. Okay, so here is your second audience participation opportunity. And again, you can use the chat. So the question is, how well informed do you feel about global warming? So you can respond with not well informed, fairly well informed, or very well informed. Personally, for me, I'm thinking maybe fairly well informed. Yeah. Oh, a lot of people very well informed. That's awesome to hear. Yeah. Okay, awesome. Thank you for participating also. This is awesome. All right. So according to this survey, we have 6 in 10 Americans, or 60%, feel fairly well informed about global warming. So if you said fairly well informed, it's okay, you're in the majority. I'm there too. But only 1 in 10 Americans, or 10%, feel very well informed, which I'm jealous of anyone who said they feel very well informed, and I hope to be there soon. But yeah, I hope to be there soon. All right, so here is our last audience participation opportunity. Again, feel free to use the chat, no judgment for your answer on this one. So within this past year, how many conversations about global warming in a non-academic setting with friends and family have you had? How often do you discuss global warming with them? So you can answer with a number of conversations you've had, if you know that, or you can just answer rarely, never, sometimes, often. And as I said here, for me personally, I'm thinking like only 4 times that I can remember, which isn't great, but yeah, that's definitely something I'm looking to improve upon, and it's good to know. Oh, a lot of people often. Okay, that's really good. Again, I hope to be there too. 50, wow. Okay, that is impressive. Yeah, I'd have to say I'm like probably sometimes, rarely to sometimes for sure. Okay, so let's see what the survey of Americans say. So 64% of Americans say they rarely or never discuss global warming with family and friends. So don't feel bad if your answer was rarely. I mean, there was a lot of impressive people here tonight who actually said often, and 50, that's incredible. But yeah, so only 36% say they do occasionally or often. So yeah, good to know where you stand for sure. All right, so now is a good time to note that we will be moving into the panel discussion portion of the event. I just wanted to remind you that you have the question and answer function. So as we go through the event, you can use that, ask any questions there. Yeah, throughout the event, it's totally fine to ask some questions. And yes, you can also upvote. So it's a function that lets you If a particular person asks or a question that really resonates with you, you can vote for that question. And then it'll be more popular and we can get to that first. So yeah, all right. So I will actually pause my screen sharing here. Okay, and I will jump to the panel questions really quick. All right, okay. All right, so our first panel question is, why is communicating about climate change important and meaningful? And I will just let the panelists take it from here.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this really incredible event. I'm Rishia, as Izzy introduced, Mass Audubon Statewide Climate Change Communications Manager. Communicating about climate change, before I dive into it, I kind of want you all to just sit with this question. Think about a story or a conversation you had with someone you care about, and think about how it made you react. Maybe it made you laugh, maybe it made you cry, hopefully not, maybe happy tears, maybe it made you smile. Stories are phenomenal tools. Communicating, conversations are all phenomenal tools to help us feel something. And that sense of feeling helps us develop a connection and a sense of empathy towards a topic. And so when it comes to communicating about climate change, we can use these stories and these conversations as tools to kind of bridge the gap and create inspiration in audiences we want to reach or in people we want to reach, and really stimulate and trigger that action we need to take in order to solve a crisis as big as climate change. Because when we think of the scale of climate change, it's going to take all of us. And in order to get all of us in action, engaged, and ready to go, we need to talk about it. And so communicating about climate change, that's our avenue. It's one of the best ways to really, really reach out to people. Another reason why communicating about climate change is important is because it helps us connect the dots between various climate impacts and what we can see in the world around us. Climate impacts vary, right? We have sea level rise, we have rising temperatures, increased severity of storms and flooding events. All of these affect our communities, and those communities can be natural, but they can also be human, right? So natural being the wildlife we love, birds, animals, plants, humans being our friends, our families, and the communities and the neighborhoods that we live in. What we also need to understand, and what communicating about climate change can help us understand, is those human communities are impacted differently based on race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and a variety of other identities. And so communicating about climate change can help us learn and understand, and again, bridge that gap so we can get acting.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rish and Izzy and everyone for being here. And I just want to jump in a little bit and talk about some of the disproportional impact and how and why climate change might affect different groups of people differently. And we know through a lot of research that environmental hazards caused by climate change are unequally experienced along a number of different lines, race and income being one of them. And a prime example that has come up multiple times within the past couple of months is the structural racism and intentional discrimination caused by redlining. And that's what I kind of want to talk about, is just one example to give you actually some meat and bones to why we see differential effects in different communities. So you may or may not have heard of redlining before, but redlining is denying services or opportunities to people on the basis of race. And it refers directly to the federal government's practice in the 1930s of raiding neighborhoods to help mortgage lenders determine which areas of a city were considered most risky. So the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation made maps and shaded neighborhoods red that it deemed quote unquote hazardous. And that risk level was largely based on the number of African Americans and immigrants living in those places. So the practice itself, along with other segregationist housing policies of the time, has had really long-lasting legacy effects, from concentrating poverty to stifling home ownership rates. And redlining has really made it difficult, if not impossible, for communities of color and immigrants to buy or refinance in certain areas. And then this causes a lack of investment in housing and housing falling into disrepair, et cetera. So, you know, just citing one particular study, and a new one just came out today that was really interesting on NPR, which I would encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to go take a look at. But there was a study done by Portland State University in collaboration with Science Museum of Virginia and also Virginia Commonwealth University, which discussed how housing practices from the 1930s are linked to hotter neighborhoods today, from a lack of investment in green infrastructure and green spaces, which heats up areas, right? Red line neighborhoods historically are also more likely to have greater social vulnerability, meaning they're less able to withstand natural and human disasters because of their more limited resources. So if we break this into kind of the larger context, like worldwide, heat waves are becoming longer and more frequent in many areas. If you overlay heat vulnerability indices with socio-demographic indicators, it's those segments of the population that are already suffering and least able to prepare that actually bear the brunt of more extreme weather. And as extreme weather events become more frequent because of climate change, and more intense for that matter, people have less time to recover from the effects of one event, which compounds their vulnerability. So when we're talking about the disproportional impacts, there are a lot of different causes, but even impacts from decisions that were made decades ago still have very long-lasting effects. And we see that in Minneapolis has come up in the news many times recently, Philly, Baltimore, et cetera. So again, climate change does absolutely disproportionately impact our population. And it's really important to kind of understand some of those key drivers so we can work towards change.
Thank you so much to both of you for starting us off. I remember actually reading that NPR article. Wow, it just blew my mind how much I'm not aware of like things like that. Yeah, all right, so we'll move on to our next question then. So the second question is, why do challenges with communicating about climate change exist and how can we combat them?
Frida, do you want to start? I think you're muted.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'll start. So basically, in my opinion, one of the reasons that climate change is very difficult to talk about with our families and friends is because it's really important the way that we phrase it, because a lot of people can think that people who believe in climate change are extremists, or we're just saying that the world is going to end. And it's really hard for some people to believe that something that has been the same pretty much for a long time can just change, and that people are telling them that we need to change with it, where we have always changed usually for ourselves. And so I think that it's a controversial topic because we need to be careful about how we're saying it, and we need to be careful about just changing the way we think about it to adapt to people who we're talking to. Because, for example, if I were to talk to perhaps my grandparents about it, they might have a different opinion than if I were to talk to one of the third graders at our lessons who haven't been around for so long that they realize that like the climate should always be the same, or that we are so good and we're so innovative and adaptable. So.
Yes, definitely. I agree, Frida. Thanks for starting off that question. I think that there are several reasons why people are reluctant to broach the topic of climate change. The first, people feel like they might not have the information that they need to start those conversations. And the second is that there is that vocal minority of people who are denying climate change. But as we know from our research, that's only 17% of Americans. So when you think about that, 73% of Americans, they're either ambivalent or concern but lack understanding. So when you're thinking about communicating about climate change, I don't even think about trying to change the minds of deniers. I'm trying to think about communicating with that 73% of people who might be worried about it, but don't know how it's happening or how they can be involved in that story. So just completely removing that piece from the equation and focusing on that 73% of the American population. And from there, you're able to actually be able to communicate valuable tools like the mechanism behind how climate change is happening. And from there, think more productively about climate solutions. So there is a lot of money in the fossil fuel industry, and it holds a lot of power and influence as a result. So there is an interest in, folks denying the impacts or the seriousness that it does have. So it's really important when having climate communications to stay away from that polarizing rhetoric. It's not, is it happening or isn't it happening? It's, this is what the science is telling us, and we believe in science. And unfortunately, there is a lack of trust right now in our society, lack of trust sometimes with the media or with politicians. So the people that we trust are our friends and our family. And so that is why it is so important to be having these communications with the people that we know and in our communities, because that way we can have a bigger impact.
Awesome. Okay, yeah. Kind of what Frida was getting at before with how you have to talk differently with different people actually leads into our next question. What is framing and how can we use it in the context of talking about climate change?
I can start off with this one. At this moment, we really need everyone to be having conversations about climate change, and we need climate change in the media, we need climate change in our curriculum, and it's so important how we frame climate change in these places so that we're not giving anyone the wrong idea of how important climate change is, and that we're actually showing that it's an emergency that needs major action right now. So because of climate anxiety, people often think that climate change, that if it's framed around natural disaster and climate refugees and food shortages and really what it really is, that it's going to make people really scared and give them climate anxiety. And I think the alternative to this is talking about how climate change affects animals like polar bears and sea turtles, and how we can fix it with really small individual actions like metal straws. And these aren't the only two options for how to frame climate change, because there's a way to give people the information on what climate change really is without giving them climate anxiety. And we can talk about the large effects of climate change, but then really emphasize inspiring action, and that they can help, and we can shift our society in many other exciting ways while stopping climate change. So for example, if we're talking about how fossil fuels are bad and they're creating an increase in natural disasters and food shortages, but we can stop this with the Green New Deal, we can switch to really cool renewable energy, we can with this, create much better jobs, get affordable healthcare, and make many other amazing changes to our society, and say, and you can make a really big difference in making these changes that will give them the real information, but also shift the way you're framing it into being more inspiring. This said, people still sometimes think that polar bears and sea turtles are much an easier topic for the dinner table or for children. But I really think that this can frame the movement in the wrong way. So an example of this is last fall, climate change, at least like in my high school circles, I'm not sure how much you guys know about this, but it was seen as like a Visco girl issue. And I'm not sure if you guys know what this is, but Visco is a social media platform that was seen as being for privileged white rich girls. And the three main trends on Visco were save the sea turtles, use reusable water bottles, and metal straws. And this kind of framed climate change around animals and not people, and also framed climate change as a very small issue that could be stopped with one small individual action. And it also made climate change seem like it was only an issue that people cared about who were privileged and had nothing else to care about. So although Visco isn't very trendy anymore, climate change is still being framed this way in the media and even in our curriculum in schools. So it's making the crisis seem insignificant and stopping people from caring about the emergency that it really is, and in turn stopping them from taking action. So it's really important how we frame climate change.
Yeah, thanks, Simone. So to follow up with that, it is so critical, and it is such a trap that climate communicators can fall into, which is feeding into that fear and that anxiety about climate change. And what the research shows us is that that actually paralyzes people and makes them less likely to act. So I heard a great metaphor one time, and it was, if you went into the doctor's office and they told you that you were diagnosed with a terminal illness with 6 months to live, would you want them to go into all of the awful things that were going to happen to you over those 6 months? Or would you rather hear the ways that you could improve your quality of life or prolong your quality of life? And so that, I think, relates with climate change, because these conversations, we want to be thinking about how we are a part of the picture, how we can help, and where the solutions are. So strategic framing is a way to use research proven communication techniques that have proven to be effective in empowering citizens, driving them towards action, using things like tested values that connect with things that people hold dear. So not necessarily, like Simone was saying, sea turtles or polar bears, but a place that you know and that you love, or people that could be impacted by these things. Like Rish was saying earlier, we can all close our eyes and picture an important place to us, an important coastline, and kind of framing your communication around those things that people really care about intrinsically, and they can see themselves then more as a part of that story and a part of that solution.
All right, awesome. Yeah, Simone, what you said about like, oh my gosh, Visco girl. I have a metal straw. I'm still like afraid if people see it, they'll call me a Visco girl. Yeah, anyways, personal fear of mine. But anyways, going on to the next question. How do you most easily start a climate change conversation if you have no idea where to begin?
I can kick it off. So at Mass Audubon, I use a handy little cheat sheet with 4 steps. And the first step is, as Lindsay mentioned, start with value. The kind of jargony marketing communications term for this is object of care, but it doesn't have to be an object, right? So like Lindsay was mentioning before, think of what really triggers your emotions and makes you feel something. Is it your community? Is it a certain place? Is it a plant or an animal that's local? The most important thing is step 2. Think about impacts related to that object of care that you see here and now. There's this term in environmental psychology called psychological distance. And there's 4 dimensions of psychological distance. There's temporal distance. When is it happening? There's spatial distance. Where is it happening? There's social distance. Who's it happening to? And then hypothetical distance. Well, is it even happening? With Izzy's awesome stats earlier, we know now that more people believe in climate change more than ever, right? Record high numbers. But there's still a fair amount of psychological distance in those other dimensions. So focusing on what we can see and feel and experience here and now, for communities of color, for our frontline communities, like Indigenous communities, as Julia mentioned before, a lot of those are the public health effects of climate change. If you live in a forested area, maybe you're seeing certain plants disappear that you really value. Maybe, you're seeing certain birds migrate earlier or leave earlier than you've ever seen before if you're a birder. Focus on here and now. The third step, what can we do? Simone and Lindsay talked about climate anxiety, right? Climate grief, and how treading into the territory of fear-inducing language or doom and gloom language can actually cause disengagement. And one of the best ways to inspire engagement is to focus on pathways to action. Can you contact a local elected official about actions you can take in your community, maybe a state official? Can you get your schools? Can you get your local institutions like libraries involved, maybe making them or encouraging them to make the switch to green energy or switching to plant-based meals on a larger community scale? And then lastly, my little ode to High School Musical is we're all in this together. Never forget that we're all in this together. This is our collective climate challenge. So no one is alone in tackling climate change. Research very clearly shows that there's a few corporations responsible for a majority of the global emissions. But when it comes to our action, we need to think collectively and we need to think as a community. What can we do together to make an impact? Because when we work together, we can make an impact. So I always use these 4 steps to talk about climate change, to tell my story, no matter who I'm talking to. I pick an object of care. I pick an impact happening here and now, something I can see. I immediately follow up with a solution or a pathway to engagement. And then I talk about how we can work together and solve this as a community.
Yeah, Rich hit the nail on the head. You said almost everything I was going to say. So definitely focusing on those shared values, people, places, important things that we care about. And I think one thing that we take for granted sometimes in starting these climate change conversations is that the folks that we're speaking with understand the underlying mechanism behind climate change. So we know that there are a lot of people that consider themselves to be environmentalists. I drive a Prius, I go to, beach cleanups. But when you ask them and say, do you understand exactly how climate change is happening? There can be a little bit fuzzy about that. So instead of just taking for granted that they understand that, explaining to them, well, so the way that this is happening is when we burn fossil fuels like coal and oil and gas, it creates carbon dioxide, which goes out into the atmosphere, and it creates a blanket that traps in the Earth's heat. So just in one sentence, you can very, very simply explain how climate change is happening. And once people understand, okay, this is a fossil fuel carbon-based issue, then they can start thinking productively about solutions. Okay, so this has to do with reducing carbon. But until they understand that underlying mechanism, it's really hard for people to engage in solutions in meaningful ways. So making sure that that little piece of communication is included in those conversations as well.
All right, awesome. Okay, kind of moving into more of the looking at education, our next question is, what can educating in the context of climate change mean and entail?
Yeah, so we need to get climate change education into schools' curriculum, and there are many, or not that many, I guess, but there are amazing organizations working on this. One organization that I know of that's really amazing is Massachusetts Climate Education Organization. But until we get curriculum in schools and education in schools, we have to take climate education into our own hands. So this means conversations And this also can be done through organizations and other types of media. So while working to get curriculum in schools, we have to make sure that the students in school right now are also learning about climate change. And Spring Forward, a youth to youth high school run education organization that I co-founded, works to educate students on climate justice, the science behind climate change, and empower students to take action. And because we're a youth to youth organization, we are able to really model to students that they have power and can make a difference and can take valuable action pushing systemic change. So climate education isn't only in the classroom, but yeah, as I said earlier, has to be in organizations and in our conversations and in the media. Educating on climate change also really has to show all sides of the crisis, especially climate justice, which is often really left out of our discussions and left out of the media, and also, which is really aggravating to me, left out of schools' curriculum, because schools are really supposed to cover everything and cover what's important, but they don't cover climate justice a lot, at least not in my curriculum. And for people to address climate inequalities, they have to have knowledge about it. So it's really important. And as I mentioned earlier, Spring Forward's lessons have a really large focus on climate justice. So while some schools are taking a step in the right direction by including climate change in their curriculum, as I said earlier, very few schools actually teach about how marginalized communities are disproportionately affected. And this can be because people can often see climate justice to cause too much climate anxiety. So kind of what I talked about earlier with the framing, or be too frightening for a dinner table conversation. And climate justice can be even harder to talk about because not only talking about all the effects of climate change that can be really scary, but also saying that it will be unjust in who it affects. So adding on another layer there. But as I said earlier, we have to talk about climate justice, and there is a way to educate on climate justice in a more inspiring way. And Rish also said to immediately follow up with how you can take action. And I think that's really important here. So educate on ways to address climate justice and how the individual can help make a systemic difference.
All right, awesome. Yeah, I don't know if any of you are as impressed as I am, but just hearing Simone talk about Spring Forward and all that they do is just, I wish I had that. I wish I had that, especially in my school system. Yeah, so for the next question, this is something I personally struggle with a lot. So how do we know when the other person is responsive enough in a conversation about climate change to begin educating about climate change?
Yeah, thanks so much. Super interesting conversation, and I wanted to like bring it back a minute to what Simone is saying about how this climate justice angle is often left out of the conversation, and that can be a really potentially uncomfortable entry point, but a really important entry point for a lot of people as well. And we know that a really big part of sustainability is social equity and social justice. And very often we tend to focus on the environmental impacts of climate change or the economic impacts of climate change to the detriment of this third very important sphere of social equity. So Simone, I think you really hit the nail on the head by really highlighting how important it is to increase the dialogue on that front. And in terms of, how do we know when the other person is responsive enough to a conversation about climate change? I think Lindsay again brought up this amazing notion that let's put the not total non-believers aside and really focus our energy on this 73% of people that are open to having the conversation. And I tend to let others bring it up because it shows that someone has the initiative or is semi-interested, if at all, in the conversation at hand. And I let them lead the way. And I find that when the individual has an opportunity to kind of steer the conversation, then it's easier to gauge at what type of information they're interested in, what they'll be most receptive to. And then again, focusing on just like moving the needle, right? So again, you're not going to take a total non-believer and engage them in conversation and switch them over all the way to a believing side, but really like what I see the purpose of having a climate change engagement is really just moving their needle in terms of the information they have, the knowledge they have, and the state of empowerment that they end the conversation with is just a little bit more than what they entered the conversation with. And I think that's also can be a good realistic entry point to, and not an intimidating one for either the person that's asking the question or the person that's engaging in the conversation too. That being said, it's always good to have some key facts and misconceptions in your back pocket. So you have multiple ways that you can present the information depending upon what aspects of climate change a person shows interest in, whether it's the science behind it or the social justice aspects or the economic implications, etc. And also it's always good to know the next step, like who else can they go to or what sources can they go to once they've exhausted your knowledge on it. And it's completely okay not to know and not have all the answers. And it's really just about, again, increasing the dialogue that normalizes it and, you know, increases people's awareness of the issues that stem from climate change.
All right, great. Okay, moving on to our next question. What are strategies for knowing how to educate different age groups or groups with different levels of education about climate change?
I can go first if anyone else wants to. So, as moving forward, I usually teach students around third grade. And I know what really helps because I went to Spring Forward's lessons at the beginning of the summer. And I know what really inspired me to join and to take more action of my own was the fact that their lessons, they can, like, the information that about climate change can get really dense or stressful and anxiety provoking, but it's really important. And I found it was really helpful in their lessons that they always followed it up with how to help and how you can help, so that it wasn't just the negatives and the effects of climate change, but also the effects of the systematic actions that you can take. And yeah, I don't have much to say other than that, except for kids, it's really helpful if like they have an interactive aspect to learning about pretty much anything. And that really can help when talking about climate change with younger kids. And
I can talk to this question next, and I completely agree with everything Frida said about following up with how they can help. I was also going to talk about that, but I think you covered it perfectly. So I want to talk a little bit about education at home with young kids, and mostly thinking about parents or guardians talking to their kids about climate change. And as I talked about earlier, it's really hard, especially with young kids, to talk about the large effects of climate change and not just resort to talking about animals and the smaller effects. But there are so many resources to help, and there are videos, there are articles, games, and so much more. Reading picture books on climate change is actually a really good strategy and good place to start, because this is a way that the caregiver can be involved but reading off of something. And it also has that arc that we want in our conversations. So most picture books about climate change would begin with figuring out that there is a problem, and then it would explore the issue and think about how to take action on the issue, finally taking action, and end with making a difference. And this is also kind of how we want to structure our conversations. So picture books can help with that. And then after, following up with a conversation. And another strategy that I think would be pretty helpful is really making an effort to give the child space to hear their thoughts and ideas. And this can help to make sure that they didn't get any wrong ideas in the past. Maybe talking to friends. Climate change is like going around probably all over kids' heads all the time, and they could get the wrong idea, or a rumor could be passed around, maybe saying the sun is going to literally melt the earth, and just making sure to write any wrong ideas that they have, and then also just so that you know how best to help them wherever they're at, and you can't know where to start without listening to them. And then definitely, as Frida said, having an emphasis on hope and on what they themselves can do to make a big difference, and not giving them the wrong ideas that 1 hour of work could fix everything, but just making sure that they know that they can really make a difference by taking action. And this is also a way that I find really useful, at least, to cope with climate anxiety.
Awesome. Really well said, Simone and Frida. Thanks so much. I'm going to just follow up with how I work with young adults and educating about climate change. And the good news is that college students are very interested in climate change. I am always so impressed with the amount of questions that we get when we come to the climate change lecture part of the semesters. So the way I like to approach it, and what students are most interested is, one, the science behind it and the broader impacts, not only to the environment, but the social equity impacts and also the impacts to the economy. So really kind of the 3 spheres of sustainability. And the way I like to approach teaching the subject of climate change is to give them baseline knowledge about what climate change is, what impacts we're seeing and expect to see, and then focus, like Simone and Frida are saying, about what we are doing about it and what we can do about it. And it might sound kind of depressing off the bat to focus on what we are doing about it, because you might say, well, we're not doing enough. But it's all about scale, right? There are some really amazing local initiatives that are doing incredible things. And this gives students hope and inspiration instead of doom and gloom, which shuts people down, right? We are actually making progress towards our commitments in the Paris Accords, even though we're not in it anymore, because of local level initiatives, not because of federal government initiatives, right? So it's really all about scale and finding the inspiration from the scale and conveying it in that way.
That's one of my favorite things to think about, that like before like going into class and like learning about it, I would always think like, oh, we're just individuals, we can't do much. But yes, we can. We can make like small little choices that actually have big impacts. And that's one of the most inspiring thoughts, I think. All right, so going into more of like the action conversation, our next question is, why is inspiring action in others and ourselves so hard, and how can we combat this?
Yeah, so I'm gonna kind of refer back to some of the points that my fellow panelists made about climate grief and climate anxiety, and also just how overwhelming, large, and looming of a problem this can seem. And so when I feel difficulty inspiring action, sometimes even in myself, even though this is my job, right? But also in others, I really boil it down to just how big this can feel. And I also think about quite a bit how when we talk about climate solutions, like not just the compost, not just the eat plant-based meals, but when we talk about those large-scale climate solutions, they're always framed as a future solution. Let's just sit around and wait for this big miraculous technology to come and suck up all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And in reality, we don't have time to wait. And that makes me feel more anxious. And I know the people that I talk to and communicate with doesn't make them feel so great either. And so first, I think to kind of overcome that barrier, we really need to sit with the fact that we don't have to wait to try and solve climate change. There are solutions that exist right now that we can utilize right now. And one of the solutions that Mass Audubon heavily emphasizes and focuses on is called natural solutions. So looking towards habitats or ecosystem features like trees, like salt marshes and forests that act like a sponge and soak up those excess greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. How can we conserve and protect those habitats that are already mitigating climate change right now? And another solution we look to and emphasize are nature-based solutions, which looks to the environment, looks to nature, and takes inspiration from those intrinsic functions and uses them to implement ways to adapt to climate change and even mitigate climate change. So techniques and strategies like building rain gardens in your communities, because that pavement that all your roads are made of and parking lots are made of does not help when a big storm hits, especially up in Massachusetts or in the Northeast, and then you're experiencing sudden flooding. So looking to nature, whether it's nature-based solutions or natural solutions, we can act right now. And that makes it just a little bit easier, in my opinion, inspiring action, knowing that we don't have to wait until it gets worse. The other thing my fellow panelists talk about that I think is incredible is this idea that individual solutions, referring back to Simone's Visco Girl metal straw solutions, they're great if you're just starting out with climate action, if you're, helping your parents, a family member, a friend, just start, getting invested. Those are great. But we also need to remember that we need to work together. As I said before, this is our collective climate challenge, and community-based action is really where this is at. And so even talking about climate grief, we can find solidarity in a community, maybe a youth-led movement like Sunrise, right? Maybe I know a variety of municipalities have climate action networks within them where people of all ages join. Mass Audubon hosts climate cafes where anyone, any age, any expertise can just talk about climate change and build that community. So really focusing on that networking aspect, that relational aspect of we're all in this together, we can do this together, I think helps us make this issue a bit easier to digest and tackle. Speaking of collective action, Julia, I'd love for you to talk about how do we get there?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rish. Yeah, so I love your assertion that this is our collective climate challenge, and the question of how do we enable collective action, and the suggestion of talking to it, starting climate cafes, etc. And that really builds social trust and social networks, right? And we know that increased levels of social trust make collective action possible. A collective action problem is a problem that's experienced when everyone would be better off solving a problem, but they don't because of individual incentives. And we usually talk about this in terms of free riders. Free riders tend to think that, if they can't be excluded from a public good or an environmental benefit once it's produced, that they might as well sit back and let others do the work. They have, little incentive to voluntarily contribute to the provision of that particular good or that environmental benefit. And in the situation of climate change, you know, we can apply kind of collection active problems very clearly. Everyone would definitely be better off. The world would be better off if we collaborated and drastically cut back our emissions, if we shared green technology, et cetera. But we aren't or don't, because many countries, the US being case in point, see it as in their individual best interest to kind of free ride, right? Or reap the benefits of the world doing something to combat climate change while we carry out business as usual, because that's where we think the money is. And the question is, how do we get over this collective action problem? And, you know, building social trust and increasing social networks is one proven way to get over the collective action problem. There are also two other major factors that help get over the roadblocks in action that's caused by collective action problems. One is motivations other than self-interest at play. So altruism, like thinking of more than just yourself. And we're starting to see this on multiple fronts. And we also, another factor that can help us get over the roadblock are kind of realigning the incentives and really incentivizing companies and individuals to do better. And we're starting to see this on multiple fronts, like with emissions reductions and carbon offsetting, the Paris Accords, where countries are coming together and pledging to take a united front on the issue, but then also using their collective social trust and using that more recently, as we saw as the US formally pulled out of the Paris Accords just a couple of days ago, shaming those that don't or aren't part of the Paris Accords, like us, unfortunately, right now. But we also see this realignment of incentives in the way certain states, like California, for example, is handling its emissions targets. And then that exerts influence on bigger industries like the automobile industry here in the United States. So again, when we're thinking about overcoming these really thorny issues of collective action problems, you know, realigning the incentives, really building social trust, and really providing the groundwork and conditions that that foster motivations other than self-interest to be at play.
And man, I hope we're back there someday. I hope we join back, and yeah. Wow. Okay. Yes. So we are at our final question, or rather final two questions about kind of the same thing. So I will go ahead and read those for you guys. So how do we continue to stay empowered in knowing that communicating and educating about climate change is climate action? How do we make plans to act that feel attainable and worth the effort?
Frida, do you want to go first?
I think it might just be you on this one, Lindsay.
Okay, that's fine. I shouldn't want to stifle her. She had something to say. So I think that it's important to remember and acknowledge that there are all different types of change makers that have the ability to contribute to successfully reducing the effects of climate change. So some of these change makers are lawyers, some are engineers, and other are communicators. So people, not all of the people that understand the science behind climate change are the best at talking about it. So talking about climate change is a part of the solution. And we know that if there's the vast majority of Americans that think that something is happening with our climate, but who are refusing to talk about it, that creates this syndrome where everyone feels alone. And what we want to be doing is we want to be changing the norms around having these conversations, right? So we want to be norming climate conversations, and that will help open the door towards getting things done. And I think it's also important to remember that we are not alone. We are not an island trying to combat this issue. There are already people in our communities all around us that are working towards these things. So what one of the ways that you can help is finding these people, add your voice to their voices, attend a meeting, amplify on social media, talk with your friends and your family, and most importantly, use your power as citizens to vote for people and policies that reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and support renewable energy. So this is a movement, this is a shift in our society, just as in, it used to be the cultural norm to be able to smoke cigarettes on an airplane. And that cultural norm has completely shifted. That is no longer appropriate or okay. And we want the same thing to happen with our climate stories here. And it's very easy to put the burden on the individual and make people feel like they have to make all the right choices to protect the planet, when in reality, it should not be any one person's job. And we need to be changing this underlying energy infrastructure of our society to make our society better, and stop pointing fingers at one another, people that aren't necessarily doing the green thing, but make it so that doing the green thing is the easy thing to do. And we've done hard things before in the past. Americans are innovators. And the biggest thing that I think we all can leave from this conversation is we need to be talking about it more with our friends and our families.
All right, I had to go back and find unmute for a second. All right, so now is the perfect time to go into question and answer. If you'd like to ask a question, you can also, if you see the little thumbs up on the sides there, you can vote on which, if a particular question resonates with you. And yeah, and those will pop up first. But let's see. All right, so it looks like the first question is, how do you approach a conversation with somebody who already has climate anxiety? In that vein, how do you help them move from a negative, pessimistic view into a more positive, optimistic one? It's a great question. Anybody? Oh, there you go, Rish.
Yeah, happy to hop in. I think we all kind of talked about the power of community in inspiring hope, solidarity, and an inspiration to act. And so, Mass Audubon, we do this program called the Youth Climate Leadership Program, where we convene middle to high school aged youth and run this kind of almost professional development workshop where they're able to craft their own climate leadership plan. They're matched up with mentors to then implement it and get it working in their community, but they kind of run the whole thing. And through this program, we've seen a bunch of youth come together and seek inspiration and hope from each other, and really see community building, not only between these youth, but community building in the communities these youth are from themselves, where they're implementing these climate leadership plans. I brought up the Climate Cafe program, these climate action networks that I've seen in various towns. Lindsay, you said it great, right? There are people doing this work, and there are people who probably feel climate anxiety with you. Seek solidarity in those people. And that's, I think, one of the best ways to just immediately frame a conversation more positively is, I'm with you.
Awesome. Okay, let's see some other questions. We have another one that some other people voted for. So a lot of people diminish nuclear power as an alternative to our fossil fuels. So what are your opinions on nuclear power as a source of energy? And if you support it, how do you think we could make it more accepting or appealing? Anybody with any particular thoughts on that one?
I think this is a great example of owning up when you don't know enough. And I think for me personally, this is unfortunately a topic that I know enough about to give an informed opinion about. So I would love if anyone else has any resources to share, or I'm also happy to look for some resources that I could share that would provide some more information on this topic.
I think one of the things when you're thinking about nuclear power is thinking about the life cycle of that type of energy. And while nuclear power can be a very good green option, there are some unfortunate byproducts that have to be dealt with. So, you know, balancing the priorities and the needs of being able to build that type of large scale infrastructure, you know, versus finding other community types of renewable energy that could be installed, like you know, wind farms or solar farms. So I think when it comes to nuclear, it's very important for different communities to do what's best for them in terms of their renewable energy strategy. And not there, it's not a one size fits all approach.
Nice. Okay. All right. Here is another question that a lot of people voted for. What can you say or do, or how can you present the urgency of climate change to help people actually make a substantial change in their lifestyle, such as the consumerism diet? Most people seem to acknowledge climate change, but aren't willing to give up habits that are harmful. Me too. I could never go vegan as an example, or some people say, I can't live without my daily package from Amazon. And they say, well, actually you can.
I could try to answer this
Yeah.
in a way. So I would actually say that actions pushing systemic change are going to be more effective. So to these specific people saying that they can't change their daily habits, can't become vegan, it can be really, really frustrating. But for them, it might in the end make more sense to ask them to take actions pushing systemic change. And something that's really interesting is that the term carbon footprint was actually invented by BP, the world's 6th largest polluter. And so individual actions aren't really the only way to address climate change, and they don't make as much of a difference. And BP, going back to that, they were doing this, making the term carbon footprint to take the blame off of their company and onto the individual. So I would say that those people who are saying they don't want to change their individual habits, you could ask them to look more into actions to change the system and to look more at companies like BP. And yeah, so that could just be an interesting way to shift, I don't know, how to address that.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so the good news is we have plenty of questions, so we'll see how many we can get through. Yes, so the next question is, as American consumers, what are some other meaningful steps households can make or can take, maybe besides an electric car, solar panels, and which things are economical to grow in their communities?
So there are individual actions that we can take, and obviously those are all meaningful. Any harm reduction is good harm reduction. Our goal is to get to those community impacts, but on an individual basis, at least in the state of Massachusetts, we have the option to choose where our energy is supplied from. So we all have the same distributors, right? Whether it's NSTAR, Eversource, but within that distributor, we have the option to choose our energy supply. So you can actually go onto your energy provider's website and you can select from a whole menu of different energy providers. So you could choose to be receiving 70% renewable energy in your home. I receive 100% renewable energy in my home, and it costs me during high energy use months, maybe $2 more than I would normally be spending. So that is an easy switch that households can make just by clicking a button on their energy provider's website.
Awesome. I actually didn't know about that, but that's awesome to know.
Quick addition to that, some municipalities also participate in a program called Green Municipal Aggregation. You can find whether or not you participate as a municipality either on mass.gov or the Green Energy Consumer Alliance's website. And if you do, if your municipality participates, it's as easy as just saying opt-in, and you can get your energy from a renewable source. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Also, in case you aren't seeing it, in the chat, there are also thank you to everyone supplying some more information in the chat. So if you're feeling free, if you're feeling like you want to check some more out, you can go look in the chat. But I will move on to the next question in the meantime. So the next question is it worth trying to set aside the term climate change and focus on the commonalities such as flooding or erosion?
So I think those are symptoms of climate change. And it's can be helpful to talk about symptoms of climate change when you are framing with the value of a particular place or location. So I think absolutely focusing on those, especially if you're telling a place-based story, like, you know, how climate change is impacting the coast of Maine or Cape Cod. Absolutely, that's when you start bringing in these symptomatic effects of climate change. But the reason we like to use the word climate change, even instead of global warming, is because it's not just about warming. It's not just about one thing or the other. It's sea levels rising, ocean currents changing. So, you know, knowing when to pick those different frames out of the larger climate story, I think allows us to be successful.
Yeah, I would say that to that, honestly, I think climate change is worth it to say in general, but say if somebody's hesitant on using the term, maybe some way you could get across to them is calling it like extreme weather, or like if they're worried about flooding the area, you can be like, all right, well, this would reduce your risk of flooding. So maybe in certain scenarios, it might be a good idea to use that. But I think overall, climate change is a term that encompasses everything that it comes with. All right, so looks like this one is about Mass Audubon for you, Rich. So how can someone volunteer with Mass Audubon's climate change efforts, and what volunteer opportunities are available, specifics or just in general?
Love the question. If you can email us at climatechange@massaudubon.org, we're still kind of crafting what volunteer opportunities look like for climate action. We have some needs for field assessments, for coastal vulnerability assessments that might eventually be moving landward, for more terrestrial vulnerability assessments. There's some communications needs. There's some educations needs with potentially the Youth Climate Leadership Program. So definitely email us, once again, climatechange@massaudubon.org. And I think that's in the chat as well.
Yeah, that's super exciting that you're already thinking about volunteering though. That's awesome. Me too, honestly. All right. Oh yes, it was provided in the chat. There you are. So maybe I'm thinking maybe a couple more questions depending on the time. Can you talk about Mass Climate Action Network, Boston CAN, and local chapters and what they are doing? Can anybody speak to that one in particular? No one in particular? All right. Yeah, sorry. Or can you?
I can't speak to the chapters in particular, but I do know that they have a variety of policy-related resources that are incredibly helpful. So if you're looking for any sort of kind of climate campaign resources, I think they had something on green municipal aggregation, if I'm remembering correctly. They've got some amazing community toolkits if you kind of want to spearhead some action in your community.
Awesome, nice. Oh my God. Okay, I see somebody in the chat. Yeah, so you can just go to you can just email them if you're looking to volunteer. And yeah, it's provided in the chat and to hear more about that further. Yeah. All right, so maybe one more question. Do you have any book recommendations for communicating about climate change? Love that question. I'm interested too.
I could answer that for kids. So I can actually put a link to, let me know if that works, but this is a link to a blog post on Spring Forward's website, and it goes through different book recommendations, some picture books, nonfiction picture books, young adult, and describes them, gives some discussion questions. So hopefully that would be helpful if you're thinking about kids.
I'm trying to think personally. Oh, you go, Julia.
Oh, no, I was just going to jump in and say, while it might not be super riveting reading, the IPCC reports are extremely informative for kind of a older audience.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I just read a book recently. I think it's We Are the Wave. I can't remember. It was the same author as Eating Animals. It was awesome. I mean, it was kind of like scary, but it was also awesome, and definitely worth checking out. I wish I could remember the name for you right off the top of my head. Okay, so
Sorry, again, more recommendations.
No. Yeah, go for it.
Of books / other authorities I love. If you want super academic, Maxwell T. Boykoff does some really fascinating both academic research, but also kind of book format research on climate change. He, I think it was back in 2009, was at least one of the first that I've read that helped establish media setting up this kind of false balance between climate denial and climate science, which actually helped perpetuate this kind of misunderstanding of and distrust in climate science. It was really fascinating research. And he's got some stuff on climate humor too and how that might be effective. So that's interesting. Catherine Hayhoe, love her. She is one of my climate communications idols. She does short form video with PBS. She has a Twitter account. She's just on it. She's a really great communicator with climate change. And then lastly, Izzy sourced some stats from here, but the Yale program on climate change communications is phenomenal. They most recently put out a report about climate change in the American mind, but with news, looking at how different news sources have communicated climate change and the impacts that it's had and how their viewership thinks about it and how that differs between outlets like, Fox News to ABC. So highly recommend them as well.
That was awesome. I mean, yeah, like you said, just look at this website, you could totally geek out. And that's what I did. And yes, thank you, Mary. Yes, it was We Are the Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer. And yes, I was thinking wave because waves are on the front, but anyways, yes. All right, so we have a little bit of time left. So I'm just gonna go back to my presentation to finish this up for you guys. And all right, it's in here. All right, so we went through that. All right, so for resources and next steps, we have this. So first of all, we're gonna give you all a little bit of homework. So with Thanksgiving and many other holidays coming up, if you don't necessarily celebrate Thanksgiving, you may be, whether it's virtual or like a little bit in person, you may be meeting with family and friends. So this is an excellent time and we would encourage you to try and make space for these conversations just to practice. It doesn't even have to be like a full-on deep conversation, just getting it started and getting yourself used to it. So yeah, that is our homework assignment for you. And we also have here all of the links for all of our panelists' websites, and you would actually go back to the web page that we have for the event, and the resources as well as the other resources I list here are all on that. If you scroll to the bottom under resources, and you can find all of their websites there. And I believe that's in the chat as well. Yeah, all right, and then finally for our last slide, a big thank you to all of you. Honestly, this it would not be possible without such an amazing audience. Thank you also for your participation throughout the entire thing. I loved hearing all of what you had to say, and the questions were awesome. So yeah, it's just, even just speaking for me, it's super inspiring to see so many people so interested in this and willing to do something. So that has been very, very awesome to have you all here. And I also wanted to say thank you to all of our amazing panelists. The work that they do here tonight and outside of it is just blows my mind. And it's no doubt in my mind that they are world changing and they're making the world a better place. And yeah, they're just very inspiring. And I really hope to continue to work with them in the future. Here on this slide is also my contact information as well as Crew's website if you want to hear more about them. If you have any questions, I know we didn't get to answer all the chat questions, but if you have a really burning question, you can just email me and I can try to figure out an answer for you. Or if you're, just want to check in on anything, make any comments, you can feel free to contact me there. And I believe it's also in the chat as well. So yeah, I just wanted to do a quick note also about an email that will be sent out hopefully tomorrow, if everything goes right. And in that email is a thank you, and we also have our post-event survey. So we would really appreciate you taking the time to fill that out. We would love to hear your feedback if you're able to. And yeah, so with that, thank you again, and have a great night, everyone. Stay healthy and well.